mean, anybody who's worked in the corporate sector knows that it's full of useless bureaucratic jobs. We have a culture that thinks that if you're not working for money, then you're lazy or you're unproductive. And because of that, we created a bunch of stupid, unproductive work for everybody to do. And that's why we're still working roughly 40 hours a week. It's a testament to society's ability to create absurdities and then also to kind of pretend that we're not living in that absurd world. Most written stuff from economists, if you can't understand it without a PhD in economics, it's probably not worth understanding in the first place.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we're delighted to be joined today by economist, author, and Modern Money Lab instructor, Dr Erik Dean. Thanks so much for joining us today, Erik.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Because it's our first time talking, can you tell us about your economics origin story? Some people we talk to had to unlearn a bit of mainstream economics to get to grips with MMT. Some people come to it from a heterodox view. How did your thinking evolve?
Yeah, mine's kind of somewhat unique. I just happened to grow up in Kansas City, or the Kansas City area in general. So I just happened to go to the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And actually kind of a strange series of events involving an independent student newspaper kind of put me into contact with some of the grad students in the econ program there. And then I got interested in it and then became an econ major at UMKC and as my undergrad, and then did the master's and the PhD. So I never had to unlearn a bunch of orthodox economics. I mean, I learned it, but it was always in the context of the heterodox stuff, including the MMT stuff.
Was there a particular aspect of MMT that attracted you to it? Some people come from angles of climate change or environmentalism or social justice.
I mean, honestly, the MMT stuff at UMKC was more the macro side, and my interests were mainly in the micro side. So it wasn't necessarily MMT that attracted me to the program as much as the institutionalism and some of the other heterodox stuff. But it's all pretty well integrated at UMKC, or was at least at the time. So I just kind of gradually came to learn about it. I took a money and banking class, I think, from Stephanie Kelton as an undergrad, and had Matt Forstatter for my macro. And yeah, just kind of fell into it, not knowing what it was until I was already on my way to becoming an economist.
Yeah. And it would be great to talk about your insights on institutionalism in a little bit. But first, I wanted to talk about, on top of all the teaching you do and the papers you've written, not to mention this free Creative Commons licensed textbook that you co-authored, you've also got a YouTube channel, which I find is a fantastic crash course in micro and macroeconomics. And I've previously heard you talk about something called privatized Keynesianism. What is that?
So if I remember right, a lot of those videos on my YouTube channel were basically in the early days of the pandemic. We had to go remote pretty quick. So I just kind of rapidly recorded a lot of standard kind of lecture stuff I'd normally do in a principles course. And at some point, a student asked me, hey, could you put those on YouTube? Because I'd like to watch them later. So I just did, which is why a lot of those videos are kind of, there's not a coherent narrative to it. It's just kind of stuff that I happen to think was important enough to record. But if I remember right, privatized Keynesianism was coined by Colin Crouch, who's another heterodox professor, I think at Amherst or New School. I can't remember actually now. But the gist of this, so Keynesian in a very basic sense that you might hear out there outside of academic economics usually just means somebody pumping spending into the economy. The kind of gist of Keynes's arguments, to make it oversimplified, is that if you want the economy to keep going, to not fall into a recession, somebody has to pump spending into it. So that could be government deficits, it could be business borrowing, it could be consumers taking out credit card debts or what have you. The kind of traditional notion of Keynesianism that came out of Keynes and the general theory and became kind of more prominent in the mid-20th century was that if businesses aren't willing to do enough investments, the government can come in and pump its own spending into the economy to keep it from going into a recession or to get it out of a recession. The argument Crouch was making, and this is kind of in line with the kind of shift towards neoliberalism beginning in roughly the 1970s, was that we've kind of moved towards this privatized Keynesianism in the sense of, in essence, households taking on debt to pump that spending into the economy. So we have this kind of move that we really start seeing, especially in the 80s, towards higher credit card debts, student loan debts, mortgages, auto loans, all of these sorts of ways that the lower middle classes kind of get put into this debt peonage system, has this kind of macroeconomic element of being the way that the economy keeps moving, keeps spending going on in the economy. So it's kind of a historical analysis of how what you could call Keynesian policy in terms of pumping spending into the economy has evolved over time.
And all the while that's going on, we've got Minsky yelling at us, this is not going to end well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it never does. I mean, that's one thing about privatized Keynesianism. Well, in this, MMT podcast, is the private sector can accumulate massive amounts of debt, but it's ultimately can't create the money to reconcile those accounts, whereas the federal governments in the UK or the US at least and elsewhere can actually continually run deficits, which it normally does, has for generations. The private sector will ultimately see a debt reckoning and a financial crisis of some sort.
So a lot of people often call MMT kind of rehashed Keynesianism. And in my head, I think you've described it in very simple terms. But is it right to say that in the 1970s, with the kind of oil crisis, Keynesians struggled with the combination of high inflation and high unemployment? And is that what is different, that MMT has a better solution for those things? Or what else would you say is different about them?
Well, the story of the kind of Keynesians and the monetarists in the 70s and how Keynesianism fell out of favor isn't really, it's not fair to at least use the name Keynes on that. The Keynesianism of that time had been bastardized. John Robinson's term for it was bastard Keynesian. Keynes's arguments, it would be hard to believe, especially in the context of the other economists he was working with back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. It'd be hard to argue that Keynes would have been unable to reconcile that period of stagflation. The people who were called Keynesians in the 70s weren't really doing the same theory that Keynes was doing and that the other Cambridge folk were doing. That's why people like John Robinson established this post-Keynesian school of thought. So, yeah, post-Keynesians are actually quite able to reconcile high unemployment and inflation. So I think that's it's a story that economists tell to establish why monetarism came to favor, as well as some other kind of orthodox school of thought, but it really wasn't the nature of the situation.
Well, what was different about that kind of bastardized Keynesianism? Because a lot of people say, well, MMT just says, let's pump the economy with money and that's it. But is there anything else to it that MMT adds to the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, the central insight of MMT is the nature of money, which is an extension of Keynes's own work on money. That's actually, I don't know if you know where the term MMT comes from, but it was originally modern money theory, term coined by Randy Ray, which is just a reference to, I think, a footnotes, and somebody will correct me because I don't remember exactly, but in, I think, Keynes's treatise on money. But the essential insight is that the government money works in a fundamentally different way in terms of its creation and its destruction than private money and orthodox economists are accustomed to thinking. So you add to that, if the government can run continual deficits, Add to that the kind of generic Keynesian insights that spending is necessary to keep the economy out of a recession. And it becomes, you have the arguments that the government can and probably should just continually spend and probably deficit spend to keep the economy out of a recession. So yeah, MMT is very much in line with the arguments of Keynes himself. It just gets tricky because by the 70s, there were so many orthodox economists who had diverged from some of the essential insights of Keynes and his Cambridge and other colleagues, that the terminology in terms of who's Keynesian and what is Keynesian gets tricky. But MMT's specific insight is that monetary component, as I see it at least.
Yeah, I love that story because the Keynes line is something like, money's worked this way in modern states for the last 4,000 years at least. And so his joke is, 4,000 years isn't modern, right? Ha ha ha. And then when people are trying to run down modern money theory, as Randy Ray calls it, and I like it, they'll go, well, it's not modern and it's not a theory, and it's like, you really don't understand why it's called that, which tells me you haven't read the book that it's named after, Understanding Modern Money. But the reason I was steering us towards Keynes is because this week in my uni reading, we're looking at Keynes's essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And he's writing in 1930, and he's saying, I would predict that the standard of life in progressive countries 100 years hence will be between 4 and 8 times as high as it is today. So, Erik, 93 years later, how would you say we're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't crunched the numbers, but that's probably somewhere around right. We're producing massively more than we did nearly a century ago. Here in the States, most people have cars. Nearly every adult, relative to 100 years ago, has a car to get around. And we have smartphones, and we can get on Wikipedia anytime we like. And there's a lot that's happened. There's downsides to that, too. Everybody has a car, but in the last 100 years in the States, especially back in the 40s and 50s, systematically dismantled urban rail systems. So you have to have a car if you want to be able to get to work or do anything else. Plenty of problems with these smartphones that are probably one of the most significant, you could call them, improvements to our material well-being. So, yeah, I mean, it's the devil's in the details anytime you talk about things like the standard of living or GDP or anything of that nature.
That's kind of what I wanted to get to. I just wanted to pick your brain on this. In your mind, what is standing between us and the 15-hour work week? Or he said 3-hour shifts as well, that Keynes was envisaging back in 1930.
Yeah, that one's interesting. And I've actually been doing some papers in the last few years with some colleagues, Swan Pham and Rich Doddsey and Michael DeLucci, on David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs. I don't know if you're familiar with that book. It's a great book, a lot of fun to read. And it kind of answers the question, and Graeber's not the only one to have asked this question, what happened to this 15-hour work week we were supposed to get? I mean, the answer is fairly obvious. We have a culture that thinks that if you're not working for money, then you're lazy or you're unproductive or what have you. And because of that, we created a bunch of stupid, unproductive work for everybody to do. And that's why we're still working roughly 40 hours a week, which is incidentally just happened to be the number that the union sets even before Keynes was writing this. So, yeah, it's a testament to society's ability to create absurdities and then also to kind of pretend that we're not living in that absurd world.
I was going to say, Patricia was saying, MMT just says pump money into the economy. That's a common misconception. And what we're saying is, now the government's the source of its own spending money. It can afford to buy everything that is for sale, priced in its currency. And then people go, well, what's to stop them spending everything forever to the moon? And we're going, well, if you read the stuff that MMT scholars write, what we're proposing is not to buy everything, but to just make sure that everybody has got a job paid at a socially inclusive wage as an automatic stabilizer, a superior automatic stabilizer to using a buffer stock of unemployed human beings having a rubbish life. So in a way, we're making the case for the job guarantee. And I see that we can get to that 15-hour work week by making the job guarantee standard eventually a 15-hour work week.
I just think that Erik raised a really good point that when we say the job guarantee, okay, bring more people into the workforce, and therefore that means everybody else can take a break in a way. But if we are truly facing sort of cultural barriers to that, then that's not going to happen, such as the ones that maybe Graeber presented in his book.
I think, Erik, in your research, I think you were finding, obviously the first thing you identify is that, well, a bullshit job, as Graeber conceived it, is not a bad job. It's a job that the person who's doing the job feels is not necessary. And that there's a lot of people in the finance sector that feel that way about their life's work, and a lot in computing as well. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. Statistically, that's what we found in our NSF data set. The computing, actually, I hadn't expected to see. And the best I could reckon on it was that if you think about a lot of what programmers are essentially doing is basically automated managerial tasks. So they probably don't feel that they're not doing heart surgery with most of that programming. They're mostly writing how to squeeze a little bit extra money out of an Uber driver or something like that. But yeah, I mean, in general, MMT has demonstrated that there isn't this financial constraints. And plenty of orthodox economists have indicated that this is really just a myth that the economic profession has maintained, because they're worried that if politicians or the people in general knew that the government could spend more, that they'd just go spending without discipline. And that's a really shameful thing for a professional group to do, is to lie to everybody, to tell this noble sort of lie. But economists like to do that sort of thing. Plenty of economists, when they're being honest, will admit that, yeah, this isn't really how this works. We're just kind of telling this noble lie about how this works, because otherwise society would go crazy or something like that.
But it's interesting how they frame what does discipline mean in terms of spending, because they often talk about this politicians having an incentive to overspend as a means of obtaining votes. But here we see the complete opposite. We see politicians always fighting to seem to be the most responsible and therefore consistently underspend in the economy, and we have unemployment and poverty as a result. So I don't understand what is the kind of discipline that these academics want.
Well, yeah, and you'll notice it's no less about the UK than the US, but certainly at least in the US, politicians have no problem overspending on plenty of things. We're close to $1 trillion on our military budget every year now. So the argument only comes up. It's actually strange. In U.S. politics over the last several years, the only time I've actually seen this argument really be prominently brought up that we simply can't afford the finances of a policy has been the student loan policy. For some reason, not collecting student loans, which is essentially a tax because the vast majority of it is collected by the U.S. government. For some reason, that's the one that's going to break the balance sheets. We'll get that with the Social Security, the pensions situation periodically too.
But all the wars are perfectly affordable.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's the thing, is it's just a myth that's kind of brought up to prevent, in the minds of economists, I suppose, to prevent certain types of spending. Certainly not to prevent all spending. And for what it's worth, there's legitimate concern that politicians don't prioritize correctly, but these kind of orthodox economics arguments never get brought up when it comes to priorities. They just get brought up when certain priorities are brought up. And that's how you end up with, you have to privatize the trains, or you can't forgive student loan debts or what have you, but you can pump ungodly amounts of money into military enterprises and so forth.
Great. So while we're dumping on orthodox economics, let's turn the corner. So Keynes has got this famous line, in the long run, we're all dead. And people use it a lot, but there's often some context missing, which you point out in one of your videos, which is namely the next line in that text. Can you talk about that full quote?
Yeah, and I haven't read the full text for eons, but the rest of the quote is, it's in the long run, we're all dead. And then after that, he says, economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task. If in tempestuous seasons, they can only tell us that when the storm is past, the ocean is flat again. And this is a kind of common criticism, a common kind of trick that orthodox economists do, where they say, okay, our theory says that this should happen. It's not happening. It hasn't happened for several years, but surely over some long period of time that it must be the case, because we derived this theory from these kind of axiomatic reasoning. So surely, okay, we've had high rates of unemployment, for instance, for several years. That hasn't been the case in the US, at least for a while, actually, but you can do this with anything. Unemployment will eventually go back down. We'll get back to full employment. But how long is that? How long is eventually? Well, we can't say. And Keynes is just saying, well, that it's useless. If you can't say how long it's going to be, if you could just kind of wave your hands and say there's this magical long run period of time that things work the way we say it's going to work, that's not going to do anybody any good.
Yeah. Surely everything's going to happen if you take a long enough timeline. In one of your videos, you mentioned an interesting thing that hadn't really hit home with me until I watched it. It was about, why did Keynes call his theory the general theory of unemployment, interest, and money?
There's actually different opinions on this. I've seen this argument before. When Charles Darwin came out with his theory of evolution, Herbert Spencer said, well, it's a special case of evolution. I have a general theory of evolution. It's basically a rhetorical device to say, well, that's a fine theory, but it's only a small part, and I've got the bigger theory. Specifically, Keynes was saying in the general theory that the orthodox stuff about how a capitalist economy works is all fine, assuming, or as long as the economy is fully employed currently. So if we've got everybody willing and able to working, you've got all the productive capacity utilized and so forth, then it's okay to talk about supply and demand and all of that good stuff. My take on that is that Keynes was just doing that to say to his fellow economists, listen, you don't have to throw out all your lecture notes. You accept what I'm saying at the kind of macroeconomic level, that there isn't a natural tendency to full employment. Then we can get to full employment, and then you can keep your lecture notes and your textbooks. I don't think Keynes actually believed that. He probably was just doing that to try to convince his fellow economists.
It's a little bit like I've seen Warren Mosler sometimes. Well, when he was debating Robert Murphy, who's an Austrian economist, who's going, no, I absolutely agree with you. This is the way it works for a fixed exchange rate regime currency. If we move to floating exchange rate, everything changes. He just leaves it there, just your thing works in a world that we're not in right now.
Yeah, and he's right. I remember that debate. A lot of that's kind of Austrian or neoclassical type material. Makes some sense once you have a fixed exchange rate. But a lot of economies don't have fixed exchange rates, and it's certainly not the general case of a world of fixed exchange rates. So yeah, very similar.
It's interesting. A lot of people say Keynes was trying to be quite diplomatic when he wrote that, and I'm wondering to what extent that created the scenario for him to be so misinterpreted later on and create all this bastardized Keynesianism. Is it your view that he perhaps contributed a bit to it by taking these stances?
I mean, maybe, but you look at the history of economic thought, and every major insight that kind of pokes a significant hole into the kind of neoclassical or orthodox economics eventually gets co-opted, whether you're nice to the people or not. So I'd say Keynes dying shortly after the war is probably what really led to that kind of bastardization, more so than any particular rhetorical strategies he took.
The status quo is pretty good at sticking around. That's how it got to be the status quo, I guess.
And neutralizing any objection to it. It's quite amazing the way it does it.
Yeah, there's a good paper by Fred Lee on the marginalist controversy, which is kind of more my wheelhouse, when economists came out and said the way prices are set is completely different from what the textbooks tell us. And if you look at the history, this is the late 40s and into the early 50s, the way the kind of orthodoxy co-opted that and said, okay, well, we'll accept, really, you're just using our textbook model here, and we'll just pretend like your insights aren't fundamentally problematic for our theory. And within a decade, they'd convinced basically everybody of that. Co-optation of new ideas and movements is central to the kind of establishment or the orthodoxy, whether it's in politics or academics or what have you.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in. So if you don't mind us getting into the weeds a little bit with the unco-opted Keynes, just for anybody new to the history and how Keynes changed things. In your online lessons, you emphasize that Keynes's view is that the economy doesn't equilibrate through changes in prices, but changes in output and therefore changes in income. Now, I've just said that in a very dry way. Would you mind saying it in a more listener-friendly way? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, this is the crux of the matter. With the orthodox theory, we usually call it neoclassical, but it goes by different names in macroeconomics, and Austrians have similar ideas, is that price adjustments will bring everything into a line. So the classic example, if you've got a bunch of unemployed people who are out of work, they want to work, what that suggests in an orthodox framework, standard supply and demand stuff, is that there's too much supply of this thing, labor, not enough demand for it, which is firms wanting to hire workers. And the solution to that is to drop wages. If you make it cheaper to hire, more businesses are going to want to hire workers. At the same time, fewer workers are going to want to work. And eventually you'll align the supply of labor, the number of people who want to work, with the demand of labor, the number of jobs. So that's a price adjustment. The wage is just the price of labor. And you could do this with excess supply or demand and any market for anything. And that's just your kind of standard textbook. This is how capitalism works in orthodox economics. And all sorts of problems with that at the microeconomic level. But Keynes' basic idea here was if you were to actually drop wages in a period of high unemployment, all that's going to do, or the main effect of that, is going to be to have less money in the pockets of people, which means they're going to spend less money, which means businesses are going to make lower sales, which means businesses are going to produce less output, which means businesses are going to lay people off. So you're going to get more unemployment if you dropped wages. And that should be kind of an intuitive thing. You don't need to get yourself a PhD in orthodox economics to know that's what would happen if you did that. But that the intuition behind that is really the intuition behind what Keynes is arguing there, which is the amount of spending in the economy, which fundamentally means the amount of sales businesses are making in the economy, is going to be what drives how much businesses produce, which will be what drives how many people those businesses employ, which will be what drives how much money people have, because that's where they get most of their money, is from working. So if something were to happen to cut the amount of spending in the economy, whether that's lower wages or businesses just becoming more pessimistic or higher interest rates for making it more expensive to borrow for investments, or the government shuts down or what have you, anything that cuts that spending isn't going to translate into a readjustment of prices and maintain us at full employment. So that's the idea that orthodox economists are saying, at least in the long run. What it's going to do is less spending is going to mean lower sales, which is going to mean layoffs. And again, that you don't need a PhD to kind of follow the intuition behind that. The price adjustments just don't work the way the textbooks say that they work. And very often they don't work at all. So the prices simply don't adjust. And that's probably for the better.
Am I right to say this was, Keynes's observation from the Great Depression, and the fact that a lot of economists back then seemed to be on denial about how to resolve unemployment, and a lot of them thought that wages would adjust and suddenly unemployment would be resolved normally and quickly, and years went by and it wasn't happening, and Keynes was kind of the first one to offer an explanation for this. Is that right?
Yeah, essentially. And it wasn't necessarily that Keynes was the first to offer an explanation, but he was a very prominent English economist at the time, as his father was a famous economist. And he knew well how to explain these ideas to the public and also to his fellow economists. So he wasn't necessarily the first to make these arguments, but he was the one who made them forcefully enough for people to kind of say, okay, that's a legitimate person right there saying what maybe we would have previously considered kind of not correct or not in line with the economics canon. So he made the convincing argument.
Would you say he borrowed some of these ideas from reading Marx, or how much of an influence was that?
I don't know too much about, there are other people who know quite a bit more about Keynes's reading of Marx. He definitely did read Marx, and a lot of the work being done at Cambridge at the time is coming from somewhat Marxian type thinking and Ricardian type thinking with Piero Sraffa and everything. So there are connections there. I don't know how significant they are. I think that's something that people debate. And honestly, I just don't know that much about what Keynes was reading, but the connections do exist for sure.
Just to get back to that original crux of Keynes's idea, the second half of that is that the economy equilibrates through changes in output and therefore changes in income.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically what I was saying a moment ago. So say the government shuts down. A bunch of people who work for the government or who work for businesses that work in conjunction with the government, all of these people are going to lose their income, at least temporarily. They're going to stop buying stuff or stop buying as much stuff as they previously would. In an orthodox perspective, okay, you've got a shift in supply and demand in various markets. This should lead to price adjustments that will balance out the economy again. What Keynes is basically arguing there is no, that it's not, you're not going to see the effects in prices so much as you're going to see it in simply in outputs and employment. So if I work for the government and I get furloughed for a couple of months, maybe I used to go to the coffee shop every morning on the way to work. Well, I'm not working, so I'm not going to go to that coffee shop. The coffee shop's not going to say, okay, well, there aren't as many people coming in as there were before, so I'm going to drop my prices on coffee. As a matter of fact, they're more likely to raise their prices on coffee, but that's a kind of separate kind of heterodox theory of prices. What they're going to do is they're going to say, we're not producing as much coffee. I don't need to have 3 baristas here in the morning anymore. I can do with 2. So what's happened is they're going to reduce their coffee output. They're not going to be making as much coffee because they're not selling as much coffee. And then they're going to reduce their employments. They're going to lay off a barista, and that's going to reduce the total amount of income being generated because that person isn't making an income anymore. So it's a quantity and income and employment adjustments, whereas you probably won't see any price adjustment there.
Yeah, no, I was thinking more like, okay, so the equilibrium that we're moving to there is a lot of people don't have an income. They end up unemployed in the absence of any government spending, any unemployment benefit, that they will die. So that's the equilibrium.
Yeah, or they'll find some way of living. But yeah, the people will simply be unemployed. And that was what Keynes was arguing in the Great Depression, because the economists had spent, the orthodox economists had spent so many years saying, no, in the long run, we'll get back out of this recession or depression. And Keynes was saying, no, this is how this works. And you can just sit in a depression for years unless somebody comes in and pumps more spending into the economy.
Yeah. And obviously the monetarist view is, oh, well, obviously the government are going to have to pay people to be unemployed, because if we let the unemployed starve to death, then everybody will be employed. And that's above our natural rate of unemployment. It's going to blow the lid off prices.
Yeah, which I guess is a fair enough argument.
Yeah, but it's just a pretty brutal way to get to full employment, isn't it, I guess? So also according to Keynes, then volatility in GDP is driven by volatility in business investment. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, and that's more complicated today than it would have been when Keynes was talking, but this is consistent with the kind of post-Keynesian stuff, as it came to be called, that was coming out of Cambridge at the time. The gist of this is that if you think just in terms of the private sector, you've got households and businesses. Households, you think mainly they go to work for businesses, they earn an income, and then they spend that income on the stuff the businesses produce. If businesses see drops in sales, then they're going to lay off some of those workers, and those workers won't have the income, so they won't do the spending, which creates kind of a downward spiral situation. So the question becomes, well, what's the driving component of the private sector spending? And the basic argument here is that it must be business investments, since household spending tends to be passive based on whether or not the people have jobs in the first place. So in essence, businesses collectively generates an amount of investments. And investment here means building a factory or something. It doesn't mean like a financial investment. So collectively, businesses generate some amount of investments. So they pay other businesses to produce machines or trucks or factories or whatever for them. And then that kind of drives and ultimately, in a sense, determines the total amount of spending that will be done in the economy, and therefore the total amount of output and income that will be done in the economy. And like I said, that all of that is kind of abstracting from the government spending as well as from foreign trade. But the gist there is that if you want to understand the volatility in outputs and employment and spending and everything, you can look to business investment, because that does tend to be pretty volatile. Business investment will go up and down quarter to quarter, year to year, decade to decade, based on whether or not businesses are interested in expanding or adopting new technologies, or are just optimistic about future sales or pessimistic about future sales. So you see a lot of volatility in that spending. And because that spending kind of has to come before the rest of the spending, the business has to build the factory before it can produce stuff and employ people in that factory. And it has this kind of driving components to a capitalist economy. But again, that's abstracting from the complexities of government spending and foreign trade as well.
Mm-hmm. And so turning the corner again, you're also the treasurer of the Association for Institutional Thought. And for listeners who are really into the money mechanics side of things, who listen to this show, and maybe they haven't dug so deep into institutionalism, what would you say are some key insights of, say, Veblen or any other institutionalist thinkers that might spark their curiosity and get them to dig a bit deeper?
If you want to kind of get a good sense and you're at a university or something, pick up the third and fourth editions of the Journal of Economic Issues in 1987. That was the institutionalists got together and said, we're going to lay out what we consider all the basics of our kind of school of economic thought. If you want to just read Veblen directly, some people love the way Veblen wrote and just love reading him. He had a very kind of interesting style to his writing. Pick up the Theory of Business Enterprise. Some people hate the way he wrote, though. If you don't like it, then don't try to trudge through it. So you can, I suppose, if you're just really tenacious. But the gist of institutionalism is it's a historical way of looking at the economy. So we think of the economy as a process of a society in general, moving through history, solving problems, and then kind of maintaining certain ways of thinking even after they're no longer relevant to our contemporary problems. So in a sense, a lot of it's a way of looking at the myths of modern economies. And MMT is in essence a kind of institutionalist school. It was developed largely at UMKC, which is a heavily institutionalist program. Hyman Minsky, for instance, was one of the Association for Evolutionary Economics presidents at once. Most of the other MMT people probably have been at some point too.
I was just wondering, what are the key differences between institutionalist economics and post-Keynesian economics? They share quite a lot, don't they?
Yeah, and they share enough where a lot of people working in these kind of schools of thoughts will just combine them. So I know plenty of people, and I would probably do this myself, who just considers themselves post-Keynesian / institutionalists. One of my professors, Fred Lee, he kind of pushed the idea of why don't we just call it heterodox? And heterodox usually just means all of the non-orthodox schools of thought. But because there's so much overlap between post-Keynesians and institutionalists, but also there's a fair degree of amicable interaction with Marxists, that we could just kind of pick from these different schools and call it one kind of unified heterodox school. And I still like that idea. I don't see a whole lot of conflict, at least between the post-Keynesians and the institutionalists. Some of it's just a matter of different styles, different kind of methodologies, different kind of key resources and everything. But yeah, fundamentally, I think they may as well be combined at this point. Others disagree with that. It's not a unified view, but that's my view.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. I mean, the MMTers are very interested in the institution that is money, I guess. And rather than abstracting away with the models of how it works, let's look at the institutions that bring it into being. I mean, it makes total sense to me. But I was just thinking this kind of ties a little bit back to this idea of like, why don't we have the 15-hour week? You were talking about these institutions that have become ceremonial and vestiges of a foregone time that aren't appropriate for the time we're living in now. And yeah, maybe the 40-hour week is one of those institutions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you think about your economics textbook is going to tell you that the amount of work being done is a result of wage bidding and a supply and demand framework for work. But then you look at how much work are people actually doing? They're doing on average 40 hours a week. I mean, there are plenty of exceptions, but that is still kind of the standard. Well, where did that standard come from? Well, that was a fight the unions had over a century ago with the corporations of the time. So that was just an institutional thing.
And to be clear, at that point, they were trying to get it down to 40 hours a week, right?
Yeah. They were getting down from like literally every waking hour down to 40 hours, which was, I mean, in the early times, they were trying to get it down to like 60 hours. So they eventually got to 40. But yeah, that was a solution to a problem. Part of the problem being workers can't literally work every waking hour, even though the factories wanted them to. That we've maintained, and you can see in the data, we've obviously maintained that 40-hour work week as the standard. And then part of the way these things evolve, institutionalists are always about how kind of cultural norms and institutions, as we call them, evolve through time. Is that, and part of this is the Keynesian component too, and it lends some legitimacy to the arguments about what if those politicians just don't have any break on their spending? They're just going to do a bunch of bullshit spending. Is that as society got more affluent, as Keynes was saying was going to happen, we didn't already have a way of saying, well, how are we going to distribute all this extra stuff we're producing to the people when they clearly don't need to be working as hard to produce all the stuff that they could ever want? So we constructed a bunch of bullshit jobs. We usually associate that with the government's creating a bunch of bureaucrats who don't really need to be there. And there's truth to that. But if you look at the corporate sector, I mean, anybody who's worked in the corporate sector knows that it's full of useless bureaucratic jobs too. This wasn't a conscious thing. This is just when you think in terms of the appropriate right way of gaining access to the stuff the economy produces is through an income earned through work at 40 hours a week usually. This is how things are going to evolve to maintain those old ways of thinking in the context of this massively increased productivity in the economic system.
So before we wrap up, Erik, tell us what you're teaching at Modern Money Lab and anything else you've got going on, online, offline, events, publications, anything.
Yeah. So I just got done just about a month ago now, I suppose, teaching my first section of, we're calling it real world microeconomics for this Modern Money Lab master's program. It's an online master's program they're doing in conjunction with Torrens University out in Australia. It's a great program. I've still kind of getting to know the program. The program's very new, so it's still growing rapidly. I do the micro course there. It's an MMT focused course. And when Stephen and Gabby actually came to me and asked me if I wanted to do the micro stuff, I asked what I usually ask in that context, which is how much orthodox stuff do I have to teach, which usually is a lot, which is fine. That's what I do. But they said, we don't really care. I mean, you could teach none if you wanted. I don't teach none in that course, but it's much more minor components than I usually would do. For that reason, I love teaching the class because we could really get into post-Keynesian and institutional and a little bit of Marxist and all sorts of heterodox ideas that deal with how households make decisions, how consumption decisions are made, how businesses operate. We actually got to get into some accounting, which is people who arts and economics programs would probably be surprised to know. Most economists don't learn basically any accounting, which you would think would be relevant to understanding how businesses work, since that's literally the language of business.
What, you mean keeping track of who's got what? That's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I had students reading what we call 10Ks here in the U.S., annual reports of corporations. And it's something I'd always wanted to do. But usually when you teach microeconomics, you got to do a bunch of kind of orthodox stuff, which is all just kind of assume this, then do the math, and there's your outcome. And yeah, we actually got to go in and say, well, why don't we just find out what the businesses are telling their investors, which you would think would be normal in a microeconomics course. But this is, I think, the first time I've actually got to teach a class in that regard. So yeah, it was a joy to teach. I believe I'll be teaching it again next summer, I guess next winter if you're in Australia.
What's the point of accountancy and understanding businesses if we can just regress everything, every variable against every variable? Isn't that the way to do it?
And that's what a lot of working academic economists do now. I don't know if you saw, there was some sort of controversy with some of the behavioralists, though, because I guess maybe some of those regressions weren't as above board as they were claiming.
And just to circle back to the economic possibilities for our grandchildren, Keynes writes, if economists could manage to get themselves thought of as humble, competent people on a level with dentists, that would be splendid. Erik, I'll give you the last word. What are the prospects of that happening?
Yeah, I wouldn't hold my breath. The older I get, the more pessimistic I get, and that'll probably be proven wrong at some point. But yeah, academic economics is pretty ossified. They've got their ways of maintaining certain dogmas that I don't particularly expect to be overthrown at any point in the future. That said, I'm very pleased to see that there are so many people out there outside of academia and economics who are getting interested in the subject and learning about it and developing a good understanding of how modern capitalism works. Because, like I said, you don't really need a PhD to have a solid understanding of how the economy works. You can just read stuff. Most written stuff from economists, if you can't understand it without a PhD in economics, it's probably not worth understanding in the first place. There are exceptions to that. I don't want to make that a blanket rule. I'm probably just pissed off a bunch of colleagues, but usually the good ideas can be expressed in ways that don't require a bunch of technical jargon and so forth. So the dentist analogy is probably not great, because I think the analogy I'm trying to suggest is that you can just do your own dentistry, which you certainly shouldn't do, but you can actually kind of just do your own economics or learning about the economy. It's not as esoteric as economists like to make it seem.
Yeah, I like to flip it the other way around. I'm thinking if we start rewarding dentists for pulling the wrong teeth out with no anesthetic, they could one day become as humble as Larry Summers.
I could see. Yeah, no, that's good.
All right. Well, we could talk for ages, but we haven't got ages, so we're going to have to leave it there. We've been talking to Dr. Erik Dean. We'll link to Erik's YouTube channel and his co-authored Creative Commons textbook in the show notes for this episode. And I'll also link to where you can find out more about the 2024 Scotonomics Festival, which takes place on the 22nd and 24th of March in Dundee, Scotland. No matter where you are in the world, you can attend the sessions because they'll be streamed live. Speakers include Steve Keen, Dirk Entz, Ann Pettifer, Daniela Gabor, Clara Mate, and BBC Economics correspondent Andy Verity. And as we've been talking about, if you want to take your understanding of MMT to the next level, regular listeners will know that Dr. Stephen Hale is one of our favorite guests and an excellent teacher. His groundbreaking Modern Money Lab is running these online graduate and postgraduate courses taught by the cream of MMT lecturers, including Dr. Erik Dean. I'm really enjoying it myself. Maybe I'll see you in class. There's a link to more about that in the show notes. And finally, for our Patreon subscribers, there's a link to all of our patron-only episodes, including edited audio highlights of the book launch of MMT Key Insights Leading Thinkers. There's also a bit of light entertainment from me, and there's an episode with Dr. Sam Levy about economics in the movies. Check out the show notes for all of the above. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Dr. Erik Dean.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.